Nestled up quite nicely between the returning faces from older Gran Turismo games and some of the, well, number of fresh faces within the vintage and classic categories in GT7 updates, we have this one, a car which for those who began their Gran Turismo journey with this game will be new to you. You'll probably have heard of the car before, but new in the game, but for those of us who have played the older games before GT Sport 5, 6, 4, well, you'll recognise this car straight away. The Mercedes 300SL Gullwing, a car which had already been technically updated to premium glory, but then it skipped GT Sport, if I recall correctly, and now it's back again. And it's easy to get lost in the shuffle. When it's a returning face that's good, it's iconic, it's collectible, certainly, but it doesn't necessarily blow all of the classics out of the water, at least on the surface. It doesn't have the most power, it's not the lightest, it's not the most or the least expensive, and even though it looks good, it doesn't necessarily have the aggression or the exotica of an old Ferrari or a Lambo. It has a distinctly more long-distance GT, long-distance tourer kind of vibe, which is essentially what the 300SL is in comparison to those others. Sure, you could consider it to be one of the first sports cars, one of the first supercars, but it's really more of a long-distance car, kind of like one of the older Astons, like a DB5. And in fact, it's a pretty good comparison to make in Gran Turismo, because the Aston is quite similar in a number of ways. Now, the Mercedes has a curiosity about it compared to a lot of the cars that you're going to be going up against, and that is the handling. See, because it's more of a GT, yes, it's quick, it's reasonably powerful, it's not too heavy, but the handling is nothing like what you'd assume a classic would be, at least 90% of the time. Most classics, certainly mid-engine, definitely rear-engine, and even some front-engine, they tend to be a bit slip-slidey, a bit boaty, a bit vague, and that can be realistic in many cases. Even some of the best of them, like your Astons, Lambos, Ferraris and Porsches. The Mercedes doesn't quite feel like that. See, it doesn't feel as quick either, which is part of the reason why. This has 212 horsepower in a just under 1,300 kilo frame, so it's not really having to cope with all of that much. By today's standards, those are pretty much hot hatch numbers, but at the time, that was a lot. 212 horsepower in the mid-50s is quite a big deal. Now, the reason that I'm bringing that up is because of the effect it has on its handling. See, this car also reminds me not only of the Aston in this game, but also in the older Forza games, there was a DLC car by the name of the Hudson Hornet. Very famous car, not seen in too many racing games, surprisingly. I can imagine that being in Gran Turismo, actually. But it's a car, and technically it has actually, Andretti's Hudson, at least not in like a full production form. But the handling on that car is quite similar to the Merc. It has this almost like no diff approach to a car where it feels like one wheel is kind of doing most of the work through corners, and it doesn't quite ever get into a full-on drift unless you almost make it do so, which is a refreshing difference actually to a lot of other classics. Now, of course, when you tune up a classic and give it a ton of power to deal with, anything can change, and I'm sure you could make yourself an absolute beast if you were to fully tune an SL Gullwing. They did, of course, make some pretty hairy racing versions, some more infamous than others, and most recently, of course, the Uhlenhaut Coupe, which sold for over $140 million, making it the most expensive car ever sold at auction. So clearly it does have a lot of prowess in the collector's world and the racing world alike. But this isn't either of those. This is the road version. This is the supercar from Mercedes at the time, if you will. And even though they are worth a hell of a lot of money now, I mean, in the game this is about 1.4 million, or at least it was back when I picked it up, I believe from the Haggerty collection, I think it was, but I could be mistaken, it may have been the used dealer, pretty sure it was Haggerty though, and it's certainly a car that is justified in being in there. Now, the curious thing about it is, on the one hand, it is a car that goes beyond its raw numbers. It is certainly quicker than 212 horsepower would suggest, and the competitive nature that underlies the Gullwing is clearly there. You can feel straight away, okay, this thing's got potential. Because sure, it's smooth, it's a tourer, it's a lot more civilized than a Countach or an old Ferrari Boxer, but it has that kind of pedigree hiding underneath, a bit more like an Aston, a bit more like an E-Type, and just like with those, it was used for racing, sometimes to great effect. Now, in the case of whether or not you need to buy this in the game, that's where things get interesting, because I think, to be honest, for most players, I don't know if I would ever say that the Mercedes Gullwing is an essential purchase, because in every single Gran Turismo game that I've used it in, I believe the first one being Gran Turismo 4 if I recall correctly, and then of course 5 and 6, then it skipped Sport again if I remember right, and now of course it's back again. I've honestly just never felt as iconic, as beautiful, as legendary for Mercedes certainly, and as great of a base for racing as it was. I've never really felt like you had to have this car. It really is very much an option, and funnily enough, it falls into the exact same camp in that regard as the E-Type and the Aston. Are they wonderful cars? Are they iconic? Some of the most beautiful cars of all time? Did they go racing, sometimes to great effect? Absolutely. All of the above. And yet there's something in there that, at least within the world of a game, just doesn't quite translate. In the case of this one, it's a relatively simple review from me because it's a very easy car to drive. It's very, very forgiving. Many classics do become significantly more twitchy with tuning, so of course bear that in mind. But even the point level is pretty low for what it is. But overall, that's it for my thoughts. Maybe controversial. It is an iconic car, a beloved one, so I could certainly see people disagreeing. But tell me down below what you think. And of course, if it is a car that you found particularly useful, maybe for a point level with a certain tune setup, maybe for a certain event, or even a certain track, then absolutely let players know down below so that they can give it a try. But until next time, I'll see you then with another review, and for now, as always, thanks for watching.